Bingham City no longer exists, but back in the early 1900s, it was known as a haven for a hardscrabble mining community, and it was here that on November 21st, Red Lopez killed Juan Valdez. Now, Red Lopez was a sympathizer with Pancho Villa. Both his father and his uncle fought in Pancho Villa's Revolutionary Army in Sonora, Mexico. They were generals in his army, in fact, and Red Lopez seems to have had a lot of sympathies towards them, where newspapers at the time made it seem like the killing of Juan Valdez was more or less an argument over a girl. Later historians said that it was probably because Juan Valdez killed Red Lopez's brother years before down in Mexico as a part of the Revolutionary War there. And Red Lopez knows he's out of luck. He has to head down to Saratoga Springs, and the law sends a posse after him. The marshal and the police chief of Bingham City, John W. Grant, he formed a posse of 3 men, and he found Red Lopez holed up at a ranch by 4:30 that evening, and they teamed up and went in for the arrests. Nephi Jensen joined Grant as they rode horses down, but both of these men were picked off almost instantly by Red Lopez, who had very good training. His father was a general in the Vista Army on the Mexican border, and basically a shootout ensued, and he made his way to the Utah Apex mine, where he holed up for about a week, being supplied by miners who were sympathetic to the Pancho Villa's cause, and he eventually escaped to be killed years later on the Mexican border in Sonora. Red Lopez truly understood how to get into a shootout with law enforcement and survive. His father and his uncle were both generals in Pancho Villa's Revolutionary Army. They were fighting along the Mexican border. In fact, his father was credited with the San Isabel massacre, which killed over a dozen Americans after they took a train hostage. And so he was also working for the Buffalo Bill Cody Wild West show when he wasn't working at the mines out west. So when Red Lopez saw a posse of 4 come after him, as soon as he killed the chief of police of Bingham City, he realized that the 3 deputized men who had no formal experience with law enforcement would scatter. And that's exactly what happened here with Nephi S. Jensen and the man who was standing next to him, George Whitbeck. Pretty much immediately, without the leadership of the chief of police, Jensen was struck in the hip and Whitbeck was struck in the chest. And Jensen died almost immediately, but it took Whitbeck about 20 minutes to die. A third man who was standing next to them, he was injured by a defective bullet, but he was down for the count. He survived, and Red Lopez continued his journey. I should mention that the initial altercation was Police Chief of Bingham City, Grant, riding into the ranch area, and he rode alongside Deputy Jensen. Both of those men were killed pretty immediately at about 118 yards as Red Lopez took sniper shots at them, and he took these shots from a ditch. Well, the other 2 deputies, Whitbeck and another man, they were both shot in the resulting altercation. Whitbeck was shot in the side of the chest, and it took him about 20 minutes to die. The ambush happened in Saratoga Springs, just over this ridge, and after he had killed the lawman and killed 2 of his deputies and badly wounded a 4th man, he decides to come back up for concealment to the mines here. And just behind me, he backtracks. He goes back to the Kennecott mine, or back in the day it would have been called the Mini Silver Mine, because there were many mines that were interconnected underground. He survives until the 29th of November off of the goodwill of other Mexican laborers. They bring him food. And then he ambushes 2 men who are trying to smoke him out by lighting a fire in the mine. And he makes his way over to Texas, where he would make it until 1921, serving in Pancho Villa's army. After the shootout at Saratoga Springs, many people were deputized. Among these were Vasil Mandrich, who's buried in front of me, who was born in Hungary, and Halsey was born in Indian Territory. And Halsey was a tracker, so he managed to find Red Lopez hiding out in the mines again, right up here behind the Bingham Cemetery. And the two men, Halsey and Mandrisch, they were both starting a fire about a week after Lopez was tracked to this mine. And Lopez, up until that time, was being supported by his fellow laborers. They would bring him food and they would bring him supplies. In fact, he had a Winchester 30-30 at the ready when he found these two men, Halsey and Mandrisch, trying to light a fire. And he killed both of them with rifle shots, and he escaped out the mine under cover of darkness and made his way to Texas. He was never seen in Utah again, and in Texas he was killed by the same Texas Ranger who crossed the border and went into Sonora, who would later go on to kill Bonnie and Clyde. Red Lopez was more or less written out of history because he had caused so much havoc and seemed to have, for the longest time, just gotten away with it. And the story was only closed a few years ago when a deputy was looking into whatever became of Red Lopez. And he found out that indeed the man had been killed by the Texas Rangers in 1921. For as overlooked as the Red Lopez case is, you'd be surprised to learn that a lot of characters within it are even more overlooked, and one of these is James D. Halsey, buried on the right there. He didn't have a tombstone for about 100 years until his case was rediscovered. He was born in 1874 in Oklahoma and raised in the mining communities of Colorado. There he learned to live a rough and tumble life and how to deal with miners. And he also learned how to track because of his time dealing with the Indians. So when the whole Red Lopez case came down, he joined the posse. He was deputized by the Utah County or Salt Lake County Sheriff, and he knew how to track, so he tracked Red Lopez to the Apex mine, and this was only a few days after he was deputized on the 21st. He was ambushed, shot, and killed after tracking him down. But the reason why his story is so commonly overlooked is because most of the other deaths happened in larger scale ambushes. I mean, Red Lopez famously killed 4 lawmen in one go. So he wasn't really remembered for a very long time, even though he was a very respected member of the community, a bachelor who was well liked by everyone in Bingham City. He was a volunteer firefighter and just an all-around good man. And on the left, you have a kind of a history of how wild and lawless these places were. This happened a few years before with the Bingham Police Department. John C. Morrissey, he was trying to, with a partner officer, arrest a man for public intoxication at an Independence Day parade. And when the man that he was with takes his pistol and goes to try to knock the guy out, just so they can take him in easier, the pistol discharges and strikes Morrissey through the heart, ending the life of a father of 5 children. These mountains around Bingham are still a very active copper mine, and when you come past here, I do want you to take a look at some of these graves behind the fallen officers, and take a look and see that all of these graves with plain, simple steel markers are unknown, probably miners who died in shootouts or more likely mine accidents. The conditions in the mine were absolutely horrible, and I've done a couple of videos on union activism in the mines, and that's a whole subject on its own, because in the request for safer working conditions, many men died in assassinations because the mine owners wanted to sap a profit from it. And pretty much every steel marker here is an unknown miner. And from one Eagle Scout to another, I would really like to thank Brad Jenks for replacing a couple of these unknowns, or at least finally making sure that people knew who they were. And before I leave this cemetery, one last thing I wanted to show you. It's kind of interesting, even though these are marked unknown, you can see that they're members of the Tome family. And before these graves totally decay, it would be amazing to see perhaps another Eagle Scout project that replaces them with something that actually does their family justice.